Okay, I'm going to start. Well, they're still coming in, so let them get loaded first. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Joyce Barrett with Heritage Ohio, and I'm happy to welcome you to Creative Zoning, Supporting Public Art in Your Downtown. Feel free to ask questions at any time down in the question and answer box. We'll be reading those at the end, I think, of the presentation. This session has 1.5 AIA Learning Unit credits, and Devin has put those Learning Unit objectives in the chat box. If you need Learning Unit credits, please email Devin at officemanager@heritageohio.org and include your AIA member number so that he can send you a certificate. I want to thank the State Historic Preservation Office for being the sponsor for our AIA continuing education credits this year. And now I want to introduce Craig Gossman, who's one of our board of directors, and the Gossman Group is the sponsor for today, the session sponsor. And Craig, take it away.
All right, thanks, Joyce, and hello, everyone. This is the last day of the first week of the virtual conference, and I think that it's going along quite well. As Joyce says, I'm a board director member for Heritage Ohio, and the Gossman Group, I think many of you know, is a architecture, urban design, historic preservation focused firm. And I actually could go on and on about that, but we're not here to talk about that today. I do have some information, I believe, in the resource room if you would care to find out more about the Gossman Group. I would, though, like to say something here about Heritage Ohio's staff, Joyce, Frank, Devin, and Joe, who have put together, I just think, a terrific virtual conference. And here's to you guys for pulling that off the first time ever. And we hope that maybe this is the last, but who knows? There's all kinds of a different future out there with what we're using now with the creative communications. But on to the business at hand, I have the pleasure here of introducing, oh look, this woman has my last name too. This is Liz Gossman, Elizabeth Villa Gossman, who if you may know or may not, but Liz is not a stranger to Heritage Ohio. She's presented at other conferences. She is currently the assistant city manager, and prior to that, the director of planning for the city of Manassas, Virginia. And she has a background in historic preservation that she's woven into her work, really with a focus on small, medium-sized towns, and she's done great work in Manassas, if any of you have had the opportunity to be there. But she has an undergraduate degree in historic preservation from Mary Washington University, and then decided to take the planning route through George Washington, and went on to kind of do the planning direction with her career, and recently was accepted into the Fellows of AICP, a very distinguished honor, which she's upset about not being able to participate in a terrific presentation in Houston because the conference was canceled this year. So we're hoping that she'll be able to pick that up at next year's conference. But in any event, today's session is Creative Zoning, Supporting Public Art in Your Downtown. Liz has got some terrific experience in that area. So with no further ado, here she is.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I appreciate that. Let's see, Joyce, am I all set?
Yep, you ought to be able to take it.
Okay, all right, I'm just gonna go ahead and take this. I'm just gonna warn everybody that I'm still getting used to this format. I'm not 100% comfortable with it, but I'm going to muddle through. So just bear with me if there's a couple of stumbles along the way. Thank you, Craig, for that. And there's a whole lot of other stories I'm sure he wanted to tell you all, but thank God he did not go in that direction. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. So let's see if we can get that to work. Joyce, can you confirm the PowerPoint's up?
It sure is.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Joyce. Okay, and now we have to, okay, there we go. Craig already introduced me, so the only thing I want to point out on my background and my resume is that I do have a bachelor's in historic preservation and a master's in planning, and that's very deliberate on my part. And I'm going to tell you that story in just a little bit, and also that I successfully learned to ride a horse at age 50, because I like everyone to know that there is life beyond planning and preservation, because I think that life stories are very important. So what I want to just start a little bit background with me and just a little bit of a story about me, because I went to a small college in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Mary Washington, which has one of only 4 undergraduate programs in historic preservation. So you might know that. And when I was a preservation student, this was in the mid-'80s, so I am dating myself. My law professor, my preservation law professor, was Chris Dirksen, who you might all know. He literally wrote the book on preservation law. So if you don't have it on your shelves, I'd be very, very surprised. And I really, really enjoyed that class. I loved law. And I spoke with Chris about an internship and clerking in a law office and what he thought about my doing that, and if he knew any firms that I could intern with. And he just laughed. He just looked at me and said, you're out of your mind. If you want to know about preservation law, then you need to go intern in a planning office. Working in a lawyer's office is not going to do it for you. Everything you want to know will be in a planning office. And I knew nothing about planning, nothing at all. So I called up the local planning office in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and told them I wanted to intern and that I was a preservation student. And they accepted me and put me working with a preservation planner that writes design guidelines and ordinances for the historic overlay district, and fell in love with planning. Still love law, and in fact get crosswise with my city attorney all the time, because I still like to pretend that I'm a lawyer without the license. So he consistently admonishes me about that. But that started a whole fascination of preservation in a broader sense of the community. So not just preservation in saving buildings, but preservation in the broader sense of comprehensive planning and social issues and community. And I think finding places for public art is all about community and historic preservation in the context of community. So as both Craig and Joyce said, we're going to talk about creative zoning. And Joyce has had me, this is the second year, Joyce has asked for me, Heritage Ohio has asked me to talk about zoning to Main Street managers and to preservationists. And I know there's some planners in the audiences as well. And my goal last year and this year is to demystify zoning. Zoning is not black and white. Zoning is not this scary thing. And you will hear me say throughout my presentation that if zoning is not working for your community, if you're running up against zoning like a brick wall, whether it's painted or not, then you need a new zoning ordinance. And that's something that there's a lot of people out there that can help you with. But today we're specifically going to talk about public art. We're going to talk about paint. We're going to talk about signage and free speech. We're going to talk about public art commissions and their relationships with architectural review boards. And a little bit about the difference between code, guidelines, and policy. And so you'll be able to win at Trivia Pursuit when those questions get asked. First, what is public art? It's anything that's visible from the public space. The thing that I like to point out about public art is regardless of who owns it. Public art seems to connotate that it's owned by the public. But no, it's visible by the public. So the image on the right is a private art piece that a private company decided to put in the front of their building. The piece on the left is actually a bicycle rack turned into public art. So if you can see it, it's public art. Mostly, we're definitely going to talk today about visual public art, murals, statues, that type of thing. There's also performance art, such as musical and theatrical events. And there's a whole nother presentation we can think about next year about buskers If you permit musicians on the street, does that mean you have to permit all musicians and that type of thing? But we're going to leave theatrical and musical aside for another day and talk a lot about murals, somewhat about statues, and a lot about paint. But first, I do want to start out with zoning. This is my zoning 101. If you sat in on the session last year, you got a whole hour and a half on zoning 101. This time you're only going to get one slide. But zoning's invisible on land. You can't see those lines when you're walking down the street. It tends to be confusing on paper, but it's really all about protecting health, safety, morals, and the general welfare of the inhabitants. And you can see a couple of cases there. Again, I like to play at law. And so as a zoning administrator, we're always looking for our case law that defines the powers that we have as planners and zoning administrators. And these are the key ones. And I always like to give a shout out to Ohio because you all started zoning in 1926. And I am going to refer to some notes, so I might hesitate a little bit and make sure that I don't forget anything. We're going to start out, there's no other panelists, there's just me talking, which will be quite dull maybe for 45 minutes. So I am going to show a little 8-minute video that I think you'll find intriguing as we set up this conversation, and I'll get to that in just a second. But just about every preservation ordinance, whether you call it a design review ordinance or preservation ordinance, a historic overlay district, you're going to have this language in your zoning ordinance. And this is really all the language you should have in your zoning ordinance. There shouldn't be other criteria there because you want your guidance to be in your design guidelines and not necessarily what we call codified. But you'll see the duties of the board referring to the Architectural Review Board shall be accomplished through the review, construction, alteration, maintenance, and demolition within the district and individual sites, and to preserve their architectural features and characteristics. And you think, wow, that's pretty straightforward. That seems real reasonable. But as you all know, because you wouldn't be on this session if it was simple, that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and conflicts. So this is where it gets tricky. We're going to stop the share there. And we're going to start a new share. See if it works. Joyce, have we got a screen?
Yes, we do.
All right. And
it all started when we got a citation to paint our building because there was some peeling paint and it was supposed to be cleaned up a little bit. And so we had been talking to Jeff about doing another mural at Metropolitan.
My name's Jeff Huntington. We're at Tsunami in Annapolis. A week ago today, I was asked by Scott, Gavin, and Jody if I would do a mural on the building.
As far as we know, there's no laws or codes that dictate colors for paint or what can be painted on your building.
And I came up with the idea of doing one of my pieces that I've been working on, and it's been evolving, and I call it Agony and Ecstasy Together in Perfect Harmony. And this painting combines two portraits. The first is a black and white portrait of an injured nurse from the 1925 Sergei Eisenstein film Battleship Potemkin, which was historically one of the most powerful propaganda pieces of its time. And for me, the injured nurse film still has always signified pain and suffering. The second painting that goes on top of this is a colorful Buddha, which is an image I associate with bliss and peace and love. So I wanted to combine these two as a reference to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey about the monomyth, which refers to the cycle of death and rebirth. And I think it's a monomyth that extends to all religions and rituals and people and nature. So I think it's something we can all relate to, overcoming pain and finding peace in our lives. And that's what I want the painting to communicate or bring up questions.
The Historic Preservation District is a real jewel here in Annapolis. It's very rare. There aren't many places that we have 17th century buildings still used day to day. And the Preservation Council exists to make certain that those assets are protected. It's
Liz, we've lost sound. There, it's back.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Chris Casey.
And I'm Kristen Lagana. Welcome to Anne Arundel County Week in Review. There's a tsunami blowing into Annapolis, but this one has nothing to do with the weather.
Well, some people are expressing their disapproval of an artistic expression in downtown Annapolis. There's a mural that features the face of Buddha and a screaming nurse from a Russian film. Gavin Buckley has it on the side of his establishment, and he says the West Street location is important, so a mural has to be out of this world.
It could be a real kind of cerebral piece, I guess. You know, it's something that like people still can think.
The City's Historic Preservation Commission will have the final say as to whether or not the mural will go or stay.
Hey, I'm Gavin, this is Planning and Zoning. Could you please call me at 410-263?
But now after this, we thought those chickens ruffled some feathers, but this thing is way worse. Chicks, man. Sorry.
You're not going to allow this type of world-class art to happen in the arts district. I don't know where you will allow it.
A controversial public art display is turning heads and stopping traffic as the City Commission will decide whether it stays or it goes.
I was as surprised as the next guy when I got an email at 7:30 at night to say, "What have you done?" And what we felt was, you know, we painted the building and we followed the guidelines in the Historic Preservation manual that says the Historic Preservation Commission does not have jurisdiction over paint and paint color.
Our own Brandy Dickey has the story.
Normally, the artwork is themed after the maritime culture or history, but a new mural on West Street has generated quite a bit of talk downtown.
I think that if it was a crab cake or a sailboat, I wonder if this conversation would even be happening, but I don't know what people's thoughts are. I don't really even know why there's a debate, honestly. We need more art in public space.
Is it an amendment of the structure, which visually it is, which they do regulate, or is it art? And reasonable minds can disagree on which of the three it is. So the real question is, does this change the structure of the building and what folks see as they go through that part of the historic district? In this particular case, the content of the mural has to be judged for its impact on the structure, not necessarily its impact as a piece of art.
I can understand an alteration, but this is not an alteration. We painted on top of paint. The windows are the same, the fascia's the same, the shop front's the same, the front door's the same, everything is the same. We don't have a problem of a proliferation of art in this town. We need a little bit more, and if one or two murals come out of this thing, then that's great.
I'm going to go ahead and stop that there and bear with me while I go back to the PowerPoint.
We're
Okay.
good.
We're good? Okay, hey, it worked. Yay. And I was so nervous about that I forgot to sort of set that movie up, and I went right into it. But obviously that's the city of Annapolis, Maryland. Maybe not so obviously if you're not in the Virginia, DC area like I am. And I love that film. And you can, the link to that article from Strong Towns is in the PowerPoint, which I believe will be downloadable on the Heritage Ohio website. And so you can read the whole article a little bit more. But in that case, the city of Annapolis obviously had a major issue with what a building owner did. And it was a 3-year lawsuit between 2015 and 2017 when it was ultimately decided. And I'll let you know how it worked out here in just a moment. But what I want to talk about is a couple of the things that were said in the video. And in particularly, I want to identify what to me is the big problem and the clash that happens. And there's another slide we'll unpack that a little bit more. But so the exterior colors, so the city of Annapolis, their design guidelines said that their commission does not review exterior paint colors except in cases when it forms an integral part of the material proposed. What does that mean? You know, as a planner and an administrator, I can tell you I have no idea what that means. And that is definitely an issue with the guidelines and not necessarily the ordinance. And we'll talk about the difference in just a moment. The city in 2015 was quoted in the newspaper, "We choose not to regulate paint. But when paint gets to the point where it obstructs or detracts from the architectural characteristics of the building, the commission members have to make a judgment call." And that's where I think a lot of our districts go wrong, is relying so heavily on those judgment calls, because particularly when you're talking about art, it's very, very subjective. And what we need to do is figure out where those clash points are before they happen and create discussion points. Before we even talk about writing in ordinances and goals and other types of things, we need to have talks about the goals of our design, historic, or preservation district. As a good example, I'm in Virginia, obviously. And so the city of Williamsburg gets held up as the example of historic preservation in Virginia often enough. Well, the city of Williamsburg is right next to historic Williamsburg, which is a reconstruction of that revolutionary city. And so they have chosen, their community value is replication. They are very clearly going for continuing the period of architecture from the 1700s. That's not Manassas's goal. Manassas's goal is to encourage, or rather to recognize our history, but to move forward, if you will. And neither one of those are right or wrong. It's just a community goal that needs to be adopted, if you will, through a lot of conversation. We need to talk about what we value in our buildings. And these are all conversations before we even talk about art. What do we value in our buildings, and are all buildings valued the same? And I will submit to you in some other slides that not all buildings should be valued the same. And then lastly, if we're talking about art, do we value public art, and do we want to make a place for it? And are we talking about art? And the reason why I showed that video is that, to me, and this is an opinion, that is truly art, because art causes conversation. Art makes you think. The picture of a crab, what was it, a crab cake, I think he said, or a picture of an Annapolis waterfront, that's not necessarily art per se. It is telling a story. It is an important piece of a downtown, but is it necessarily art? That's what I think. Each community has to have a conversation and discuss that for itself. So what I would submit to you when you're starting to talk about this, you talk about it in 3 ways. And this graph is a little bit like that story where the old woman ate the cat that ate the spider. You remember that from talking about your children's books. A locality starts with their comprehensive plan. The plan, and sometimes there's a small area plan, a downtown plan. The plan sets your community, its vision, and its values. You know, all those conversations that I just talked about, those discussions, need to happen in your comprehensive plan. And then your zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance is not this carved in stone, hard and fast. It's what is the tool. The ordinance provides the minimum standards to achieve the vision. It's a tool. So it's not something necessarily from the state. It's something that a locality needs to craft for themselves to implement the vision of the comprehensive plan. And then your design guidelines, this is the spider part, the guidelines provide context for approving projects that meet the standards of the ordinance that then implement your plan. So in this graph, there really should be a loop going back to the comprehensive plan. And each of these have very, very different roles to play in your downtown. So I'm going to give you some ideas for these three documents, starting with the comprehensive plan or maybe your downtown plan, and that very first question about whether or not you value arts and potentially how does it fit in your downtown. Manassas, as I said, is very different than Williamsburg, Virginia. We have deliberately chosen a tagline that is historic heart, modern beat. And we see art as a way to exemplify the modern beat, very specific conversations about this. And so we have goals related to cultural and arts that support public art in our downtown. If you don't have this as a founding block, then the clashes are definitely going to happen. And then in ideas for ordinances, you know, that next building block, that zoning ordinance, some of the ideas are about differentiating between the types of buildings in the historic district. And there is nothing wrong with specifying sets of rules that apply to different types of buildings. Sometimes you'll hear zoning administrators, we have to treat everybody equally. Yes, there is some legal parameters about treating everyone equally, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about signage in the second part of the presentation. But you can differentiate, just like different pieces of property. There are different types of building that might necessitate different rules. And Hamilton, Ohio was just there last night for a concert, and saw the webinar earlier in August on public art for Athens and Canton and Hamilton. And the Hamilton design guidelines specify a particular class of building. They call it their basic list of historic properties, which will not be considered for murals, period, end of story, not a judgment call. We do the same thing in the city of Manassas, where our landmark buildings are our pristine Williamsburg type of, they shall be placed in bubble and not altered. And then with other buildings, we have a whole lot more flexibility. So that's just one idea. You know, ideas for design guidelines, we talked a little bit about this, and I'm pretty sure Craig is still listening in, and he'll recognize this photo from one of the ones that we saw in Baltimore. He mentioned a road trip we took not too long ago. But considering whether or not the art is reversible, you know, or does it permanently change the architectural features? Is it on the facade, or is it on a side elevation? I love this picture because not only this is not even a mural, this is actually a statue that comes out of the building, but it's reversible. It can come off the building, and for me, that's a big piece of when we're talking about art, is whether or not it's reversible. You know, you heard the attorney in the Annapolis talk about content changing the physical or altering the building. That is an interpretation or a decision that Annapolis has made. That does not necessarily mean that all communities need to make that same. And now I will tell you what happened in Annapolis. They won a part of the court case. The courts did rule in the city of Annapolis's favor that based on their design guidelines, that it was an alteration and it needed to come before the ARB for approval. And so it was not just paint, that it was an alteration. However, they lost on the argument about content, and the mural was approved, and I haven't been there recently, but I still think it's, yeah. So the mural was retroactively approved by the ARB, because as you'll hear in the second part of this presentation, content becomes a completely different discussion than whether or not you can alter a building. And I would submit, if there was anyone listening that was hoping that I was going to say public art should not go before an architecture review board, that it doesn't alter a building, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say that. I do believe it is an alteration. I do believe making a decision about paint is within the purview of the architectural review board. But I think that under those parameters, to have the conversation about what is going to be in the purview, and I'm going to show you another slide in just a moment. But I just wanted to point out 2 links in this slide, and also I believe I provided those handouts for Heritage Ohio as well. Baltimore City, which is the city that Craig and I visited a couple of weeks ago, has a really great design guideline chapter on artistic expression. And so I provided that for you, as well as the city of Manassas' design guidelines for murals. As I said, I sat in on a Heritage Ohio session on public art. It was Athens, Canton, and Hamilton, and I stole this slide basically from that presentation. So if those folks are on this, thank you very much for giving me this information. Plus this quote, because I love this quote: "An arts community without artists is simply a community that purchases art." And that kind of goes back to that crab cake comment also, versus are you going to truly let artistic expression, or are you really just promoting the crab cakes in your city, which is fine. Not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you need to have those conversations and make that decision. But in Canton, the speaker provided that the ARB approves what they call permanent installations, pieces of art, but not temporary art. And they qualify that with 6 months. And that's an idea. You know, a lot of art, particularly murals, are expensive. They stay out there a lot longer than 6 months. So come up with a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is. Again, it's what is pertinent to your community. In Hamilton, Ohio, the ARB determines when a building should or should not be painted. And that's somewhat the same as Manassas, Virginia. We determine if a mural is appropriate on a particular building, but we do not consider, we do not talk about the merits or the content of the art. I'll talk about sculptures in just a moment, because I'm just as sort of a side thing. Generally, I do think, and we can debate this again, and again, it's really based on your community, but generally, I do think that ARBs should not rule on artistic merit. They should only look at the impact on the building, and then making those decisions within the context of the values that your community has on what alteration means to you. An art commission or a committee, if there's a concern about artistic merit, which sometimes there is, can tell you a quick story about City of Manassas thought we would do a cute little artistic tourism thing, and we painted a bunch of boulders at the front of our city as a welcome into the city, and we painted them in our logo colors, and we thought that was just absolutely adorable, but the community thought it was trash and hated it, and so the boulders went to a public park, so they're not in our gateway anymore. You know, reactions, that is just something that you have to deal with. But if you have artists, if you have people that are used to judging art, they are the ones that can provide the basis for those decisions. And it doesn't have to be a appointed arts commission. In Manassas, we just use a loose arts committee that makes recommendations to our city manager. So we can talk about more of that in the questions. Joyce, let me break in for just a moment and ask you a question. do you think we can take a few questions now on that
Sure.
question? And then
Sure.
go to part two?
Sure. We do have one question already. Jenny asks, what are your thoughts about the vinyl type skins that are usually photos applied to brick? I believe they last 3 to 5 years and also do not damage the brick.
That is a really good question. Because one of the ways to define a mural is to define it as actual painting on a building, and as a original work of art. We had a lot of conversation in the city of Manassas about it being an original work of art and that we wanted it physically painted on the building. And so not accepting vinyl. Now, it's not to say that a vinyl wrap cannot be original, can obviously be an original piece of work that has been printed on vinyl. And I think the issue with the vinyl on the brick, which is very removable, is if you're going to allow murals on, let's say, front facades or historic brick, then absolutely, I would think that's something to take a look at. In Manassas, we have said no on facades, and if historic brick was not previously painted, that's not something that we'll permit as well. And so that is the conversation to have, because that's the trade-off, right? That if you want to allow it on the historic brick or the front facade, paint is damaging, right? Paint is very difficult to get off brick. And so the vinyl wrap would be potentially a perfect way to not damage, but allow that temporary piece of art, even if it is more like 5 years. Thanks, that's a good question. Any others, Joyce?
Not from the audience yet, but I wonder if you want to address, when we had the last Arts Commission webinar earlier in August, one of the discussion points that came up very near the end is, sounds like semantics, but this participant felt very strongly about it, that art is not subjective, that it's objective. And how the responsibility of a review board approaching it as subjective rather than objective makes a difference. Did you, you maybe haven't had time to think about that, but.
You could have given that to one meeting earlier. That's probably a debate question as opposed to a answer the question. Because I think art is very subjective. I think art is very, very subjective. People either like what they see or they don't like what they see. And different communities have different tolerances for what they want to see. And again, that's not to judge a community. Some communities are very comfortable with some edgy art. Other communities are not going to be comfortable. So the trick is, again, to have those conversations and then identify who is going to judge the appropriateness in your downtown, not even necessarily set aside the whole idea of whether or not it belongs on a historic building, but is it something that you want in your downtown? Excuse me, just a moment, Craig. Sorry, we have two people in the room. Does that help Joyce a little bit?
Yeah, but I think it's something that should go into the community discussion, and I'm not sure people do think that far ahead, because it's easy. Again, once there's a problem, then it's a problem, and
Right.
Anything that you can alleviate ahead of time by understanding the differences between those words. And again, I think your community ethic is what you're teasing out, right?
Right, exactly. I think the objective versus the subjective, there's dictionary differences there, but it's really, you just hit it, Joyce. It's your community ethic. First of all, do you value art as a discussion, or is your art going to be more about the history of your community? As talking about the city of Annapolis. Previously, the art had all been about the history of the city, with the vignettes and the black and white photographs and potentially food on their building. I don't know. I know he was tongue in cheek. I think the point you're trying to make, though, is sometimes, how do you get ahead of those discussions, right? before the mural comes up with the Buddha and the injured nurse. How do you get ahead of those discussions? And I think you get ahead of those discussions by not doing what Annapolis did and say, well, we're not going to regulate paint, except if we think in our judgment it alters the building. That's not what you want to do. You want to have a conversation now about murals and art in general. And then you might not address all of the issues that come up, but you've had a good start.
Thank you. So there are no other questions, so you might as well proceed.
Okay, sounds good. So I wanted to touch on, because I want to touch on a little bit about zoning and signage and free speech and content, because in an art session that I was in person, when we still had in-person conferences back last year, there was a presentation on these wonderful, fabulous art programs and all these ideas that I was taking down to take back to Manassas. But a lot of the questions were, but legally, how do you put that up? Isn't that a sign? So I was going to hit on that issue a little bit and talk about art or signage. And we'll go through this rather quickly. Again, we're still kind of talking a lot about murals. But frankly, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road when we come to our public art. But again, murals, painting, other works of art, they can be unique or they can be classified as signage or both. And again, that really depends on the municipality where they reside. And that's another one of these sort of, again, my common mantra is to have these conversations. So let me go back to that. Well, I won't be able to go back and keep my slides going. But you saw the mural on the right-hand side with the dogs, and that was adjacent to a dog park. And generally, you would say, well, what's wrong with that? It's a dog park and it's a plain brick wall. We're not even talking about a historic, that's a cement wall right there, and it's dogs running. Well, Arlington County, Virginia is very clear in the ordinance that outdoor murals include no picture, symbol, or device of any kind that relates to the commercial business. Well, the business that was in that building is a doggy daycare, and their logo is on the bottom of the screen there in the PowerPoint, which is the same cartoon dog that is the background for the doggy park. And so Arlington, and this was upheld by the courts, determined that it was a sign, and this building owner did have to paint over their cartoon dogs, and they did another mural with no dogs in it at all. But again, sort of leaving nothing up for chance here, Arlington being very specific in their ordinance, and being very tight, no picture, symbol, or device of any kind. That's a very strong statement that very specific, as opposed to more of a judgment call. But just to confuse you all further, this is the slide or the picture that Craig was referring to in his comments when he introduced me. He was very impressed with this mural of ice cream that was on this building on Baltimore. And in this case, it almost looks like this was even not almost a wall put up against the historic building for the mural, not even being painted on the side of the building, which is potentially another way to protect a building, is to affix the mural to something that then is affixed to the wall of the building and can clearly come off with no damage to the building. But in this case, the city of Baltimore does their design review first. And so their design committee rules on the merits of this, and then it's presented to the zoning office to ensure that the mural does not contain an advertising message. And in this case, the business that is going in is a deli that, in addition to sandwiches and beer and salads, does also sell ice cream, but it's not their primary business. And so Baltimore has chosen that this is not signage. And again, that's just to prove to you that it's not black and white, even though you might feel that way sometimes in your community. Again, just a little bit of case law so that you know where zoning administrators are coming from. And part of the reason why I provide this case law is I want you to go down, you know, if you're the Main Street manager, and I want you to go talk to the city engineer and talk to your zoning folks about how they interpret the zoning ordinance. Because these are the things that they are relying on. This case law that's in this presentation are the things that they are relying on. And so generally when we are regulating signs, we are not looking at content. We are not reading the sign. We are prohibited from reading the sign. We can somewhat determine whether it's commercial versus non-commercial, because there's a free speech element there, as evidenced in this photograph. But sign regulations really need to be restricted to time, place, and manner, and not on the message that is being provided. And so it's really important, I'm gonna skip that, really important that your ordinance or your guidelines differentiate between that. So possible solutions for this issue, again, defining a mural in your design guidelines. You know, the person before with the question talked about the vinyl art on the buildings, which would not be permitted in my city, because for us, a mural is a hand-produced work of visual art, which is tiled or painted by hand directly upon the exterior wall of a building. But you could easily come up with a more liberal definition that allowed, because you were more concerned about the paint on the bricks. You know, setting a time limit. Mural must remain intact for a minimum number of years, regardless of who's in it. So if the doggy daycare leaves and someone goes in there selling flowers, the dogs are still there for another year or two. And then you can see some of the others, and again, specifying the place. That still does not get you, to Joyce's point, completely in the clear. And if you look at the picture to the right, and yes, that is Craig Gossman there on the bottom, you know, this is in Stanton, Virginia, and this is sort of very clever. So you have a historic mill building there. Obviously, it was the White Star Mills Company, and the White Star Tavern is going to go in there, apparently. You know, what do you do in that case? And I don't necessarily have a good response for you in that. Is that a mural or a sign? There's always going to be someone that pushes that envelope, if you will. And to the question that was asked before, I don't think there is any ordinance or any plan or any design guidelines that are going to get you 100% in the clear. But again, the mantra is to have those conversations often and many, and to build those relationships. Just another example here, and the internet is just full of them. This is just Portland, Oregon, which has gotten sort of very detailed on talking about hand-produced works of art. You can see does not include mechanically produced or computer-generated prints or images, but not limited to digital printed vinyl. So there's a community that decided absolutely not. That's not something that they want to do. But again, other communities may decide that they want to. So clear as mud, I know, and that's actually really the point of my presentation, is that every locality is different. Every locality places values on their art, on preserving their buildings, on their green spaces. This is a park in the city of Manassas, and our buglets, where we painted the outlets, which is how we do our Christmas lights in the wintertime. You know, every community has a different ethic, as Joyce pointed out. And so where is the appropriate time in your process to have that conversation? And I would submit that it's, if you haven't had it, have it. But you start it with your comprehensive planning, and then it runs throughout all of your documents, including your zoning ordinance. Because again, I'll just close with, if your zoning ordinance is a detriment, if it's not supporting what you want to do in your downtown, then you need to change your zoning ordinance. And you can do that. It's not carved in stone. Most of the zoning ordinances across the country right now were written in the 50s, 60s. They were tweaked in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Only now in the 2000s are people starting to rewrite their zoning ordinances. And so that would be my recommendation. Joyce, that is my presentation. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Oh, we've got plenty of time.
Great. That's the problem when you only have one speaker, but I was hoping the video would take up some time.
No, it's great. Everyone tends to be shy about asking these questions, but please put it in the question box, because as we go to close, then they start flurrying and adding things.
Oh, is that how it happens?
Yeah. So we'll give them just a moment to articulate how they might want to ask that question.
Start a debate. If
someone started a debate. Now, this is interesting to me, these utility boxes, which I love, they're adorable, but they seem like significant tripping hazards. They're not next to the trees.
They are. They actually are, and that was one of the reasons to paint them.
Okay.
Because that was the issue. So quickly, 2 quick stories while we wait to see if anyone has any questions. So we had this issue with the utility department deciding to put these boxes. I don't know why. I think because the trees were going to grow. I don't know. Far away from the trees, and they painted them green so that they blended in with the grass, and they thought that was great, which was great until the complaints came in and kids and everybody were tripping on them. And at the same time, we hit on our very first public art project was called Little Bits. So I have a very conservative community. Manassas is very conservative. Southern Virginia, it takes us a long time to move the bow of the Titanic. And so we decided our public art program was going to start with what we called Little Bits. And so we invited artists from the community to identify little bits of things that they could paint throughout the downtown. And someone, this was not the city staff, had the idea to paint those green utility boxes that people were tripping on. And we call them buglets. And they've been fabulous. People don't trip on them, and they take pictures of them now. So, and that then sparked other small bits around the city, including just individual bricks of some of our historic buildings. Just these little vignettes of individual bricks of our historic buildings. And then a couple of years after that, we got our first mural, our first full wall, mural. So it's starting to grow. The other thing, real quick, are there questions, or can I tell one more story? No questions?
Another story.
Okay, well, I feel bad then. Maybe this wasn't a very good presentation. But the other quick story I'll tell you, we'll talk about sculpture then, since we have some time. So the ARB from City of Manassas, the Architectural Review Board, does not regulate sculpture. We have made a determination that sculpture is not a building, that it's not a structure, and that it is, even though temporary could be 5, 10, or 20 years, that it's not potentially 100 years. Again, that it's not a building, that it's not a structure. And that it was a very deliberate conversation that we had with our Architectural Review Board. And so we wanted to do sculpture in the downtown, but we had no budget whatsoever. So we teamed up with our local community college, and the professor there had an honors sculpture class. And so every year now, his honors sculpture students, their final semester, their final thesis for their honors sculptures is to design a piece of public sculpture that then we place in our downtown in the city. And we get a dozen works of art. I'm sorry, I don't have any photographs. A dozen works of art free that the students, and part of the whole honors thesis is not only designing the art and coming up with the art, but they have to think about the fact that it's going to be displayed by the public, that it's going to have to weather and be outdoors, that people might touch it. We had one piece of art that was shards of glass, and we're like, that's not going to work. We've been doing that for 4 years now. This is the first season we weren't able to do it because the students weren't in the studio, obviously. But it was a real great partnership. And some of the students have sold their sculptures, so they switch every year. So every May, that year's honor students put their sculptures up in the downtown. And like I said, it's a kind of a clever way to get a dozen unique sculptures every year that change. And the cost.
Great story. Have you, like the buglets and things like that, have you paid artists for small projects?
We have done little material reimbursements. So we've scraped together a couple $100 here and there for paint. And for the artists that we have in our downtown, that's been sufficient. I'll tell you right now, a problem is that we've run through the gamut of local artists and they are a little bit burnt out. So when we ask them to paint a bench or a fire hydrant, they kind of shake their head and say, you know, they can't do that anymore. So we are looking, we just got a NAACP grant of just $550 to pay a young graphic artist to paint one of our utility boxes. That's a big hulking, again, green. You can see green is kind of the color in our downtown. So that's the default for our utilities company. Everything gets painted green. And he's going to do a very cool graphic. It's going to be a little edgy for Manassas because it's going to be a very urban vibe. But they're giving him a stipend of just $550. But we are going to be 150 years old in the year 2023. And so we're going to put forward a budget proposal to actually commission a piece of art in honor of our 150 years that is not a history piece, but is a community piece. And so particularly with all the issues of community and equity that are going on right now, our community is 30% Latino, 15% African American, you know, a very diverse community. And so we want to represent not our history, which is post-Civil War and has a lot of connotation with that history of our founding in that 1873 period. We want to do something that resonates with our current community. So we will be paying for art. That'll be our first foray into that.
Great. I got some comments coming in. So okay. Some are questions and some are comments. Jenny says we're trying a fall flower pot contest to decorate the town's flower pots. Idea from Medina. So we're excited to try some public temporary art. Judy, the presentation was great. We just have a very strict guidelines, which I personally approve of. And Doug, did you run into problems with local professional artists using free student art?
No, that's a really good question. I'll answer that question in just a moment. Where I ran into problems is when we did have a conversation about whether or not we should scrape the money together to pay for art, whether we should put out a national call for artists. Because then once we talked about paying for art, local artists started to get all, hey, wait a minute, don't pay a national person to come in when we've been here providing. But no, the professional artists have been very supportive of the students. And they help critique. Like, as I mentioned, there was one artist that wanted to propose a sculpture, a public sculpture that was shards of glass. So we get to see the mock-ups of the sculptures before they go into production. And we give our local artist committee, I should talk about that for a minute. As I mentioned, we don't have an arts commission, a formal arts commission. We have a loose network of artists and an arts committee that helps judge artistic merit, and it is all artists. And so we give a critique and advice to the students, but no, they didn't have a problem because they're willing to give free art to the community because they see it as a community benefit. But they definitely started to push back when we started talking about putting together budgets that would then recruit national artists without, you know, without putting them on a level playing field or first giving them a chance or setting aside money for local artists. So it was more concerned about national or international artists coming in, which we're not there yet. So I'm not too worried about it yet.
Jenny also asks, what is the best way to attract local artists to work cheap. Any suggestions on trying to get more modern art when your town is 200 plus years old and very proud of their history, which sounds like Manassas is kind of like.
Yeah, you have to, they need to feel welcomed. You know, and if you've got an artist group, you know, one of the things to make sure is that you're involving a variety of different artists. You know, we do have, you know, we have one art collaborative that is very tried and true artists, and they do a lot of vignettes of Manassas. It's a little bit like the city of Annapolis, in that a lot of their art tends to be vignettes, realistic painting of images of Manassas, and we were bored of that. And so we just started very gently reaching out to other artists and asking them to sit down for coffee and join arts committee meetings to give us different viewpoints. Now this one that we're gonna go out a little bit on a limb, and I don't, you know, mind talking a little bit about race relations. So this young man is Black. None of the folks on our arts committee are African American or Hispanic, which is a major issue in the city of Manassas, as I mentioned, our demographics. But we're really having trouble outreach to those communities. But in this instance, the NAACP said, you know what, we'll help you find an artist. We will help you locate, in this case, a young artist who was willing to put himself out there. And they put up, like I said, a small stipend to go ahead. And I think because the NAACP right now, particularly in the period of time that we are in our country, they realize the importance of making those steps. And in Manassas, people are comfortable with small, measurable steps in progress. We're not getting pushed for bigger pronouncements, I guess. But that is an issue in other communities, definitely, where you get pushed maybe beyond your comfort level.
Tom Spring says, nice to see you, Craig, and thanks, Liz. Please get some other questions. And because you just broached on that, maybe you could tell us what Manassas is doing about if you have any Civil War monuments or sculpture that you're dealing with now.
Sure. Luckily, we do not, and I say luckily, because, you know, sometimes you just don't want to deal with some issues. Freudian slip there, but we do not have any public memorials. We didn't fly the Confederate flag, even though we're a Southern city. We didn't have Robert E. Lee on our city hall doorstep. We do have a Confederate soldier who is in our cemetery, and he is over unmarked graves of Confederate soldiers. If a little bit of history lesson, when the war was over, the federal government came and generally located their dead and brought them back to their families, but the Confederate soldiers were left where they laid, which obviously for the South is still a deep-seated point of contention to this day. And so the Ladies Memorial Association was created, and they gathered up the remains. And if they could identify them, they did. And if they couldn't, they buried them and erected these monuments. And so we do have, our position is that it's a grave marker, and nobody has argued with us to this point. But we did have, when there was a social media rumor going around when the protests, so after George Floyd's murder, the protests hit everywhere. And so we had Black Lives Matter protests in our downtown as well, and marching through our downtown. And our, across from the park you see in the screen is a larger park that fronts our Manassas Museum. And it's our town green, and the protesters wanted to rally on the town green, which is great. But they said, well, we're not gonna rally there because we understand it's over the graves of slaves, and you buried Black people there. And we were stunned. We were like, where is this coming from? We've not heard this. We don't have any evidence of this. And it took us several conversations and sitting down and looking at documentation to convince folks that that was a rumor. It was not anything that we had any evidence of. I can't claim to know exactly everything that's under the ground in the city of Manassas because we were a battlefield. But that was a hard discussion, you know, to have. And ultimately, they did have the Black Lives Rally Matter on the lawn, and it went just fine. But the just, you know, navigating that whole space and the role that art can play in navigating that space. And that's when I say that we want to do a really big community art project in 2023 that helps us talk about our history. 150 years. We were a southern city, but it was a Yankee that laid out the grid of streets in our historic downtown. You know, this is, and now, as I said, we're 30% Latino. So we have a big history there to talk about. So it's going to be interesting. In 3 years, I can come talk about that, Joyce.
Yeah, that'll be a great project. So we don't have any other questions. That means you covered it. I mean, it's a challenging topic because I think most of our communities do want art and they want to express creativity. And as historic preservationists, we don't want to be the bad guys stopping it. Right. But each community does have to have that discussion of how they blend contemporary creativity within their historic context. Wait, here, see, I told you there'd be another question. Oh, it's just thank you, Jenny. I loved your session on zoning last year too, she says.
Oh, that was really nice. I think I just want to touch on that, Joyce, because I think that is the debate. So I'm just going to go out on a limb, and this is not me as a preservationist, but I know one of the comments said, you know, they have very tight design guidelines and they like that, and that's fine. But if you have a community that is not happy with that there is a segment of the community that's either clamoring or quietly griping, then I think as a preservationist, it's not all about protecting the integrity of that building as much as about also creating a place where we all feel welcome. And so look at what some communities have done and said, okay, this is a landmark building, and it's, you know, our old town hall, our you know, in the city of Manassas, we have an old town hall that's an architect design building, and it's a very special building, and, you know, we wouldn't put a mural on there. But we have other, you know, more vernacular buildings. You know, we have teeth missing, you know, where there's a building that was destroyed, and so there's those vacant walls in between historic buildings, and so those are old interior walls, you know, or like Manassas with the little bits, where we did allow little vignettes painted on individual historic bricks that now it's like this game. People go looking for them, and it's a way to get people through the downtown because they go looking for the little vignettes that are on individual bricks. Look for ways that people can have that outlet. But if you've got that in your community, if you don't and everyone's happy, then great. But I would submit that there's probably other people out there with different opinions.
Right. I think we found that last year when we did the crosswalk project in Van Wert. It was a very colorful crosswalk. There were hundreds of comments on Facebook, and we all know how Facebook is. Mm-hmm. They were all positive. People were crazy excited for it. So I think that there's an unmet need that they just don't even know how many people want creativity.
Right. And that's a good idea, Joyce. I'm sorry, we're going to continue on just real briefly. But you know what? Start public art with the infrastructure. Crosswalks, asphalt, the little utility covers that I show in this picture, those big honking utility boxes that are black and green, let that be the initial, you know, if you're not ready to think about buildings, look at the infrastructure. You can find places to put art in your historic downtown. Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay. Could you share photos of the vignettes? They sound awesome. Can you pull some up real quick?
You know what? That might take me a while with my share screen.
Well, I'll do closing comments while you're messing with that, maybe.
Okay.
If you're an architect who wants the LU credits, please remember you need to email Devin Miles, office manager at heritageohio.org. And remember, you have to include your AIA membership number. Also, do you have them up already?
No, I was trying to get
You're
to
looking for it.
the internet because
that's fine.
if it'll let me do it. Yeah, there we go.
On Monday, please remember to join us, building code officials, Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Building code officials are part of your revitalization team with Tim Monet, who we love from Worcester. And in the afternoon at 2 o'clock is accessibility requirements for multifamily historic housing in historic buildings. And in the afternoon, the happy hour is going to be creative uses for public spaces, which will be some Main Street managers sharing their creativity. Thanks again to Sandvik Architects for being the title sponsor for the Heritage Ohio Conference. And again, thank you to Craig Gossman for the Gossman Group being the day sponsor today for our sessions. And thank the State Historic Preservation Office for being the AIA credit sponsor. So it looks like Liz is on the right page now.
Yep. Yeah, and Joyce, I'm happy if people want to email me. My contact information obviously is available, and so people can email me with any questions or give me a call on the phone. But this is our art page. You can go to City of Manassas website, and you can hit under things to do and find our art page, and you can see the different things that we're doing. We have banner art, we have murals, sculptures in the city, which is the I'll show that in just a moment. That's the community college kids. But Little Bits is what we were just talking about. And here's another good thing. We just, our Little Bits is all about little pieces of art throughout the city of Manassas, and we just started with infrastructure. And again, if you're not ready to touch on buildings, then I would definitely go for your infrastructure. And I just want to see if one of the vignettes, which well, there's one little piece on a historic building. It doesn't really, oh, there we go. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to stop it. But that's just a vignette of a painted brick. And here's a picture of an artist who's painting a door on our city hall. So he's not touching the bricks. And there's another vignette. I'm not sure how to stop the scroll. But literally, it's an individual brick. There's another one, on our city hall. And, oh, I like this one. This is my favorite. It's just a little peeking out. But people go looking for them. So let me I also want to just show. Okay, so you can also do sculptures in the city. So these are just an idea of the art that the students come up with. And again, that costs us nothing, that we put throughout the downtown. That one, actually, the students sold that one. That's one of the pieces that was actually sold. But they're cool. And they're neat. So if you have a university or a community college, I'm sure you've got fine arts folks. And the community's very comfortable with a little bit of avant-garde on this. None of this is too edgy. This is all pretty simple. But because it's there for a year. There have been a couple sculptures we've gotten some complaints on. There was one that people thought was frightening, but then it's gone in a year and people forget about it. So yeah, so look at our website.
Great, well, thank you very much. It looks like some fun ideas. So we're at a close Friday, our first complete week of the Heritage Ohio Conference. And thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, Craig. And we'll see you next week at some of the conference sessions. Bye.
Great, thank you.